So we said that for this episode we were going to talk about why we decided to embark on this project of podcasting between the two of us. And I mean, that's good because it brings our discussion right up into the present moment where we're at now, and gives us a segue to start moving into the real core element of, I think, what we both want this to be about, which is analysing and critiquing the popular view, the popular paradigms that are prevailing in the discussions, various discussion spheres at the moment, and how they relate to the ego death theory. So far, the first two episodes have been pretty much, each one has been one-sided, focusing on one of us. And I think for this one, it would be better to be a bit more combining, a bit more discussion-like.
Right.
But I think that our motivations will probably turn out to be very similar, even though, as we've discovered, our angle into the ego death theory and this new mode of understanding has been actually very different. But I think we're fairly similar, on a similar track with regard to why we want to collaborate now.
Yeah, and I think that makes a certain amount of sense in the kind of from the theory perspective. You know, we each come from a different kind of background, cultural background, with our own, you know, individual, ego masks, so to speak.
Right.
And then through learning about the topics of the theory and exploring the altered state, we come to, not so much move away from that, but I don't know quite how to put it, but focus on things that are, focus on something universal in a way. That might not be the right word either, but something, I'm grasping at something here. Does that make sense to you? Kind of moving from those, I mean, it kind of makes it has kind of a narrative kind of sense to it, moving from the individual sense up to almost to the black universe.
I see what you mean, yeah. So we're moving from the personal to the general.
Yes, yeah. In much the same way that in the kind of altered state experience, there's kind of a disconnect from your personal into the, as the kind of eternalism black universe mindset comes on, that causes a shift from just your individual egoic perspective. So all I'm positing is that starting from our completely different angles, we're kind of arriving at kind of similar purposes, you know?
Yes, I see what you mean, yeah. I think Michael Hoffman wrote somewhere something along the lines of, every initiate is initiated in a separate time and a separate place, but in another level, every initiate is initiated in the same time and space, because it's this kind of timeless, universal experience of ego death.
Right. Yeah, no, I think that's a good way to put it, that like from the eternalism perspective, there's no difference in time or space.
So, I mean, first of all, the idea of a creative collaboration between me and you has been almost an inevitable, logical thing for a long time, and especially since Michael Hoffman awarded the 3 degrees in Transcendent Knowledge. It seemed obvious that you and I are the two people who have the correct motivation to go about doing something like this and trying to push forward and move the field on. A friend of mine is into martial arts, and he was telling me about how martial arts styles are created and then moved forward, and it's very similar, because he said every style starts off with one individual teacher, and then sometime towards the end of their life they appoint a certain number of grandmasters who are all much younger than they are, who they personally certify to be able to exemplify, personify their style and remain true to the style that they created, so that after they die, the grandmasters that they've appointed can go on and teach a next generation. And it seems very similar to what's happened here, in the sense that Michael Hoffman has basically devoted most of his life to creating this theory.
Yeah.
And now he's starting to think and talk about passing it on to the next generation, and me and you are an integral part of that. We're the two people who've kind of been able to take on board this paradigm and then reflect it and use it to communicate on the internet.
Yeah, and actually communicated about it. I mean, the number of people that we've encountered who are also communicating about it is relatively low so far. But so that seems an integral part, you know.
Yeah, I mean, Michael Hoffman he seems very optimistic about the number of people, and I'm sure there's a lot of people who have had private communication with him that we don't know about. So he sees it from a different perspective, and he talks more optimistically about the number of people who are catching on. But then again, he only chose to award 3 degrees.
Right. To yourself and me and to Daniel Boone.
Yes, and I'm wondering if Daniel Boone might at some point be interested in participating in this collaboration, but that remains to be seen.
Yeah, he seems to, I mean, overall he seems less focused on communicating the theory in an online setting, at least in recent days. I seem to remember, 2008, 2009, him being quite active.
Oh, that's right, yeah, he was.
But less so recently. So, I don't know. Yeah, I think it could be worthwhile checking in with him and seeing what his interest level would be and contributing in some form. But but I do think it's natural for the two of us especially to collaborate because we both in different ways have been discussing the theory openly online in no uncertain terms as adopters of it as a way of thinking.
And we've been in communication with each other for a number of years. It was, first of all, we were communicating on the same forums, and then you took the initiative to reach out to me, and then we've had sporadic communication ever since then. And this is kind of the ultimate communication of that multiple years of development.
Right.
We don't really have anything else to compare it to in terms of a radical new paradigm and what ought to be the take-up rate and how many people ought to be catching on at a particular time. And we just know that Michael Hoffman is the sole creator of this new paradigm. And it seems like, at least from my point of view, it seems like there's a relatively low number of people. It's certainly not the case that millions of people are flocking towards the ego death theory and, in some kind of collective realization of the superior coherence and explanatory power that it has. Or if they are, it's invisible from the point of view of the great mass of pop psychedelia information that you can see in psychedelic books and on the internet. So whatever catch-up and adoption there is at this early stage, it remains very much hidden. And you and me are pretty much the most public face of it, I think.
Yeah, that certainly seems to be true. I haven't really encountered many other people, especially in print. I haven't encountered many other people citing it. Now, there's a few that are cropping up, but they're mostly kind of, brief citations of say, one aspect of the theory. Mostly say, if the maximal entheogen theory of the origins of religion is correct, then blah, 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 blah. But I think that's true that we've been at the forefront of discussing it as a whole paradigm and whole theory.
Right, rather than trying to single out certain isolated aspects of it.
Right, yeah, and kind of taking it on board as a fully radical. I mean, I experienced that quite profoundly when I was, probably 2006 to 2008, just to refer to an earlier part of our podcast discussions. I experienced that quite profoundly in the sense of it being a fully radical paradigm stretching across a number of different ideas. And it's not just about adopting one radical idea. The really true power and, fireworks comes in adopting it across a whole range of ideas and seeing how all those radical ideas are all consistent with each other.
Right, a systemic revision and updating across a wide domain of fields. And in that respect, it does actually seem like the academic system is almost set up to avoid anything like the ego death theory from establishing itself within their range of thought, because the academic system is so strictly separated and segregated into these different fields, which have very limited potential to cross over each other and influence each other.
Right.
So the ego death theory is kind of almost invisible to academia because of how broad it is and what the broadness of the number of fields that it affects.
Yeah, it's like either you adopt it fully or you, it's difficult to make mention of it because
right.
as soon as if you start directing, it's kind of like as soon as you start going down that rabbit hole, you end up on the other side. There's no kind of escaping. Yeah, so I almost wonder if the kind of what you're describing as a slow pickup. I mean, not people immediately flocking to it, at least in print, obviously, or even on the internet, obviously. I think to a certain extent that's I don't know, that's almost inevitable in some ways, because people have such deep commitments to their current paradigms, both intellectually, socially, economically, that it takes a certain amount of time for people to be willing to invest in a different paradigm and move out of what they're currently invested in.
Right, and on the last time we spoke, you used the words careerism, careerist thinking, which
right.
I feel is such a pervasive force in what I experience from immersing myself in the pop psychedelic scene, going to various psychedelic conferences and reading lots of books about it, is that there's an obvious focus, an obvious motivation to try to maintain careers, and it's very, very difficult in any way to try to maintain a serious career where the subject matter of your career is an illegal substance. So
right.
People try to work their way around that, and there's all sorts of kind of dancing around this idea of that the thing that they're trying to deal with is really illegal. So they end up trying to cozy up to it, and they don't tackle prohibitionist thinking explicitly and fully, and it ends up infecting their own thinking. So it ends up being prohibition compliant.
Yeah, I think that's a great topic. I think that we could devote a lot of time to pointing out different figures, because a lot of people have been very successful, it seems to me, in that, in that way, this sort of half prohibitionist mentality. I could think of organizations and scholars, but I don't know if it's worth digging into details right now, but who still kind of their idea of working, I don't know, of attacking prohibition is this very piecemeal sort of approach, and this kind of like, look, we're not doing anything that's too radical here. We just want to make drugs legal for a few certain purposes, and that's all we're talking about.
Right. The name Rick Doblin is springing to mind. He seems to have established an entire career on the basis of promising a certain model of how drugs could be used in a respectable and legal framework, but it's a model that doesn't exist anywhere, which is the idea that you could legalize certain drugs like maybe MDMA and LSD, but only for therapeutic purposes, and for other purposes, for recreational purposes, for example, they would remain illegal. And he seems that he's put all his eggs into that basket. He's based his whole thing is about trying to say that paradigm is around the corner, and that one day very soon we're all going to be able to sign on to a special place and go and take MDMA with a professional counselor there or something. But to me, it just seems like endlessly prolonging failure and prolonging the inevitable failure, that you can't really do that because there's no official background, there's no to set that up, to have an illegal drug that becomes legal only in this very specific setting. And I mean, even the setting of like a psychotherapist office, it's not, there's no strict scientific theory behind it. It's all very kind of vague, quasi theoretical. So it just when I read about it, it just frustrates me, and I'm thinking, no, that's not the right way of doing it. That's never going to get anywhere, and so far it hasn't got anywhere. And it amazes me how, well, I'm thinking in particular of Rick Doblin, but how he's able to endlessly prolong this empty promise. But we'll see. Maybe he does end up having some success, but there's been none so far.
Right, there's been none so far. Yeah, I was thinking, like, his organization is MAPS, correct?
Yes.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I mean, it could, I think to a certain extent it's worth looking into what they promise, because it seems that maybe I've just become more aware of their kind of marketing, or, I don't know, their presence on the web and in different places. They seem to be at least successful in that regard.
In that everybody knows their name, everybody's heard of them.
Everybody's heard of them, and they certainly advertise successes of some sort, basically successes in getting their studies funded or
Yes.
getting their, getting allowances from the government to use the substances in their way. But I personally am, I think a key point there that you were starting to talk about was the whole therapy, the therapist kind of model or system,
Yes.
and that that really occurred to me when I was looking at some of their information. You see it again and again that what they're trying to offer is this kind of safe route that we know that drugs are dangerous, but we have these specially trained people who are going to make them safe. And so therefore, because we've created this therapy hierarchy, it's kind of like a priesthood in a way,
Exactly, yeah.
Therefore you should let us have access to them, but we are going to denounce, recreational use or kind of keep it at arm's length, so to speak.
And unsupervised use in general. There seems to be the implication there has to be a certified supervisor every time you want to take drugs. Otherwise, it would be illegal.
Yeah. So there's definitely some very questionable elements to that paradigm, I think.
Right. But it's enormously pervasive. The general association between psychedelics and psychotherapy is very firm and fixed in the kind of Western mind. And that goes way back to the early days of when LSD was first discovered, before the 1960s, when it became associated with hippies and everything. It was people like Humphrey Osmond. Humphrey Osmond is the man who actually created the word psychedelic in a correspondence with Aldous Huxley. And he was a psychologist, and he used to work with seriously psychotic patients. And one of his ideas in those early stages was that by tripping you could get insight into what the mind of a schizophrenic person is like. So already at that early stage, they were kind of using it as a way of connecting to people with mental ailments of various kinds. And it's moved on from that. And I don't think nowadays anybody really takes very seriously the idea of LSD in relation to schizophrenia. It's become much more toned down now, and it's more about talking about your emotional issues while you're high on MDMA, maybe with a therapist who was also on MDMA, and using the drugs to kind of facilitate the extra emotional opening or whatever. So that's really the major focus of that model of using psychedelics.
Right.
So that's the psychotherapy paradigm, and I think that forms a very distinctive subsection of the overall what I would call the pop psychedelia paradigm, and it's one of the main ways of trying to get respectability for psychedelics, entheogens. But it's not the only one, and another one that's very important is the area that Martin Ball is involved in, and I'm sure I would like to talk a lot more about Martin Ball. I think that his way of looking at things and way of talking is wide open for deconstruction in terms of the ego death theory.
He's close to the ego death theory.
Yeah, he's certainly much closer than the psychotherapy camp are. He's actually thinking about what tripping is, and he's focusing on the altered state experience as a subject of analysis, which is starting to get very close to what ego death theory is doing.
Yeah, so the idea is that Martin Ball is going to inevitably run into the ego death theory, and in a way probably already has. I mean, we've seen some of his, I've seen some of Michael Hoffman's postings about, Ball talks about the shadow or something like that, this kind of new agey term, but that is the problem, the threat of ego death looming in the altered state. And so in a way, it's we can help, show. I mean, I'm also thinking too, in addition to the critique, I think it's important we make it kind of constructive in a way and show them how they can move closer to the ego death theory, why the ego death theory is a more attractive option than their current paradigms. Intellectually speaking, just for coherence and for providing the fullest model of what goes on in the altered state.
Yeah.
Because that's really what has drawn us to it. There's nothing that really compares to the depth of explanation that actually pushing through towards the ego death and not trying to like skate around the outside and use psychedelics for some other purpose.
I think as far as Martin Ball is concerned, he has worked out the ego death theory. He feels that he has created a comprehensive theory of the psychedelic experience. So our role would be to, and Michael Hoffman's role in writing about Martin Ball's theories is to show where it doesn't get it quite right. It doesn't go far enough. And I think the major blind spot in Martin Ball's writing, I mean, I think it's helpful to name the paradigms, and we've named the psychotherapy paradigm as the kind of the whole school of thought that tries to put psychedelics into the psychotherapeutic setting. To name Martin Ball's paradigm, and he's certainly not the only person, but he's one of the main people. It's something along the lines of the New Age positive thinking spirituality type paradigm is what he stands for.
Okay, and
the crucial blind spot, which I think that paradigm has, is it doesn't address the issue of control loss and the negative, unpleasant aspects of psychedelic experiencing. He kind of gives it some vague acknowledgement, tiny bit of mention, a little bit of lip service, but he doesn't put the focus on that. He puts the focus on more kind of floaty, happy experiences of positive energy and that kind of thing, whereas the ego death theory is really putting all the focus onto basically the control loss dynamic and ego death experience, which is not a pleasant, glowing thing.
No, certainly not at first. You can learn to kind of be aware of the dynamics and play with them a little bit, but no, it's not, certainly going through it the first time, there's a reason why we lay claim to the term ego death. Like,
as if, death would ever be a happy, easy thing to go through, because you've got to sever all of your attachments to life before you can get there, and that's not going to be an easy process. But I really resonated with when Michael Hoffman did the recent interview with Eric Davis. He said the harrowing part is the fun part, and not just the fun part, but it's the whole. It's the main part. It's the part that if you haven't understood that part, you're missing out on the most exciting, the most mind-bending and fantastic area that psychedelic experiencing has. And I think that Martin Ball is in that place, that he thinks that he's already found the great, unlocked the full potential of psychedelic experiencing, but he doesn't go into this particular dynamic enough and realize the world of transformative and intellectually regenerating kind of properties that ego death and control loss have.
I certainly didn't pick up on any of that from that video that you sent me of Ball's presentation at the Breaking Convention conference.
He talks about oneness and non-duality and non-separateness.
Right.
And that becomes the core feature. So whereas for Michael Hoffman and the ego death theory paradigm, the core aspect is control loss, for Martin Ball, the core aspect is non-separateness. And I think that when you really analyze that concept in the specific terms of the way that he employs it, he's talking about something spatial and physical. So he talks about physical objects like the tables and chairs and that kind of thing. And to experience oneness in the psychedelic state is to realize that your bodily physicality is one with the physical form of all these other things. And that's kind of quite missing the point as far as the ego death theory goes, and it's not the most interesting dynamic to realize that I'm one with a chair or anything like that.
Yeah, right. The greater kind of threat is like, you're one with the source of control thoughts, and that what does that make you in the end?
Right.
If the control source is just giving you those thoughts and you're just an extension of that, what have you been doing all this time?
So he falls into the trap which Michael Hoffman has really identified of trying to have it both ways, which is to say, having non-duality and spiritual transformation, but retaining free will and egoic consciousness as being fully real. In other words, my ability to choose my future is still fully real and choose my next action. And for the ego death theory, those two things are incompatible, because to experience oneness and to realize that I am not separate from anything is at the same time, as you said, to realize my oneness with the ultimate control source, which means that I, as a separate ego, am not able to, I don't have effectively causal power over my future in light of this control source that's kind of above me and behind me.
Yeah, so I liked when you said that Ball kind of represents the kind of New Age paradigm, which in my experience tends to focus on this kind of non-duality and on kind of free will, kind of taking control of your life and envisioning what your future is and making that future come into existence through just envisioning it.
Which is like self-help, really, ego empowerment.
It is, yeah. It's kind of like self-help under a different name and kind of dressed often in kind of Buddhist or other Eastern motifs.
Well, it calls itself Buddhist and Eastern, but I'm not really sure how close it is to the original essence of Buddhism and Eastern religion. Sure. Because, as far as I'm concerned, Buddhism and Hinduism is just as entheogenic as Christianity is.
I agree. Yeah, that's why I say kind of like dressed in the motifs of. It's kind of like takes some style from it, and there's probably, it's been a while since I've studied Buddhist texts, but there's some inspiration there for talking about non-duality and oneness. But as with most people in the modern era, it seems that these New Age proponents have missed out on exactly what that means, which is, we're saying the real meaning of non-duality is not physical non-duality or something like that, but is your very thoughts, their non-duality with the control source, the source of all thoughts,
right?
Which is a far more, like I said, threatening and profound sort of thing than kind of simply physical non-duality or somehow intellectually recognizing or agreeing that, in fact, everything, is connected in some vague way.
Right, exactly. It becomes so much more scary and profound when the additional issue of my ability to trust the controller X, the ultimate control source, and whether I can trust it, whether I'm compelled to trust it, what would happen if I don't trust it. It's those kind of issues that really bring the raw power of psychedelic experiencing, I think. Right.
So we've kind of singled out two kind of competing paradigms so far, in the psychotherapy paradigm and the kind of New Age paradigm.
And another one would be the neuroscience paradigm, which is really exemplified by people like Professor David Nutt of Imperial College London, one of the great neuroscience research centres. And he's taken another researcher under his wing, a guy called Robin Carhart-Harris. And what they do is they use LSD, psilocybin, MDMA, and they give it to people, and then they put those people in MRI scanners and scan their brains and try and find out what changes it makes to the brain. And again, this is a wide open field to be critiqued in the light of ego death theory, and really what they're even trying to achieve, or whether the results that those kind of people are getting have any real relevance or validity. Something that I feel very distinctively about Robin Carhart-Harris, having read a lot of what he says, is that he tries to describe the neurophysical underpinnings of psychedelic experiencing in a way that makes it sound like the phenomenology. So, for example, he'll talk about, you take psychedelics and it makes your neurons start to... it's hard to think of an example off the top of my head. So Aldous Huxley...
But it's focused on it's more focused on the, brain chemicals than it is on the subjective experiencing.
It bears zero... He goes to no effort whatsoever to really describe the the content of the experience other than using very cliched things. Like I was going to say Aldous Huxley, he talked about how psychedelics reduce the filtering that consciousness normally imposes a filter on experience. And then when you take psychedelics, you cleanse the doors of perception so that you can see without filters. And, so Carhart-Harris will adopt that kind of description, which is only very rudimentary and stuck 50 years ago that someone thought of that. But then he talks about the neurochemistry, that, I don't know, neurons and serotonin and that kind of thing. And I feel it's almost deliberately bending the language to try and make it sound as if there's a direct physical correlate. So in other words, when your mind and your consciousness is undergoing this reduced filtering per Huxley, so there's some element of your brain chemistry that is normally filtered and is now being unfiltered by the rush of psychedelic chemicals. I hope I've explained that clear enough. Maybe I'll try and find a sound bite from Carhart-Harris to describe that. Are you familiar at all with Carhart-Harris or not?
I'm not. No, I'm not. But I'm be very interested to learn more because, so it sounds like there's also, my own encounters with some of this neuroscience paradigm are more on the U.S. side. I can't really name names or remember names, basically, but it seems to be that's the major trend within kind of the official academic publishing world, right, is that of neuroscience. That's kind of what gets funded and published. There's plenty of books from high-level presses that are that take this kind of neuroscience approach to psychedelics. And from what I've dipped into them, they have, just as what you said, they have these very cliched descriptions of the altered state, as if Aldous Huxley and Leary were the end all and be all of actually describing what goes on in the altered state.
So they're moving away. They're not trying to update the discussion in that domain. They're trying to shift it into a different domain, which is in neurophysics and the chemistry of what happens in the brain. But apart from anything, MRI scans are not very precise in terms of what they reveal. Trying to scan a living brain while it's actually in the middle of doing what it does is notoriously difficult. But what you mentioned, how respectable the neurophysics paradigm is, that owes to a reason which is much more important and fundamental, which is about the general philosophy of mind, or the metaphysical picture of mind that modern Western society has, which is it's physicalist or materialist, which is to say that the brain as a physical substrate of consciousness is the primary reality, and consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon. Do you know that word?
Yes. It's an extra phenomenon, a kind of added on thing it's not the real essence.
It sits on top of the physical underpinning, which is the brain and chemistry, but it doesn't have any real causal power. So, in other words, the modern academics, that modern kind of scientific positivist paradigm has it doesn't matter about saying no free will. They're actually very friendly to the subject of no free will, because they are saying that consciousness doesn't have any real causal effect. But it's totally physicalist and materialist. And I think that's the reason why this kind of neuroscientific research gets so well funded, is because there's an implicit assumption behind all of this that the physicalist or materialist metaphysical picture of reality is the accurate one, and therefore that would be the only valid one to really kind of find out what's going on in psychedelic experiencing. So,
right, that's the baseline for determining some kind of truth criteria.
Exactly, because the whole trip experience, the whole phenomenology, according to that view, is merely an epiphenomenal, basically inconsequential result of the chemistry of what's going on when all these chemicals suddenly arrive in your brain, and your brain, the metabolism starts happening differently because it's got a different chemical makeup for a few hours.
Right.
So that has its own issues, but I think those issues are much more about the philosophy of materialism versus idealism, which for me as a as a person who was educated in philosophy, that's absolutely crucial. The main debate in the academic philosophy and just modern philosophy in general doesn't concern free will and determinism or possibilism and eternalism. Rather, it's much more focused on physicalism versus idealism. But idealism is considered to be a redundant, almost insane or absurd position to hold. The real contrast is between pure physicalism or physicalism with some kind of epiphenomenal, inconsequential thing added onto it.
Yeah, so it's like they're like trying to describe, I guess, one thing I'm picking up from your description of this is that they're trying to describe, what they think. I mean, so they take these things to be reality, right? They think that the real core constituents of reality are the brain chemistry, and same thing with the philosophers, that like core constituents of reality or whatever, the kind of the physical nature of the mind.
Exactly.
But I wonder what they, and it's interesting you mentioned that they're quite friendly to no free will because they view consciousness as just a extra thing added on top anyway, so why would it matter?
But that's only when no free will is construed in a way which preserves the reality of temporal causation, which is
really?
Definitely not the kind of, they are very unfriendly. I'll be very honest with you. When I raised the subject of atemporal determinism to my professor, who was kind of a Freudian-based old school emeritus professor, his exact response was, "That's fucking bullshit."
I can't even conceive of it.
Exactly, but I didn't have the confidence or the wherewithal to pull him up on that point at the time and say, well, hang on a minute, this is a intellectual theme which goes back to Parmenides through Einstein and Minkowski on into Popper.
Yeah.
How can you just dismiss that?
Well, that's one tactic people use, but
almost humiliating someone on the basis of the presumed authority that this person has in that setting. He's the professor and I'm the willing researcher, and he's telling me what is legitimate, what is not legitimate. And I learned with a shock that you can't say anything about atemporal determinism in the academic environment.
Yeah, that's fascinating. So this is in the philosophy department.
Yeah, and so they stick to the temporal-based model of determinism, which, as Michael Hoffman has written very recently in the Yahoo group post, that position actually ends up affirming egoic logic because of the way that it preserves the reality of temporal flow and causation.
Mm-hmm. So they're friendly to. I mean, so one key aspect of our critiques here is describing how these positions relate to the concepts of free will, no free will, possibilism, and eternalism. And so we could say the neuroscience people are friendly towards a certain version of no free will, but not one that in any way kind of impinges on, I don't know, really people's... It seems like from what you're saying, they don't give a whit about what people's actual experience of time or of their own sense of self-control is. That doesn't constitute something even worthy of study because that's all just an epiphenomenon to them.
It's an epiphenomenon at best, or completely non-existent at worst.
Or complete bullshit,
Yeah. And the guy that was the head of the philosophy department when I was studying there, he prided himself in being a pure physicalist and absolutely saying there is no such thing as phenomenology at all. It just doesn't exist. And I think one very good indicator of where these people are at. So I've been talking a lot about this guy Robin Carhart-Harris, who's really the poster boy of psychedelic neuroscience at the moment, at least in the UK, and in the zeitgeist of what they call the modern psychedelic renaissance. Although, as you pointed out in the last recording, that's a really annoying and naive thing to assume is really going on. But anyway, the point was this guy Carhart-Harris. he goes to all this effort, and there's all this money behind him studying the neuroscience of tripping with volunteers who come and sit in MRI scanners. But the man himself very openly says he has never tripped himself. He doesn't know what this experience is like, and I don't think he has any interest in knowing what this is like. So it's a very weird, backward attitude of trying to study something whilst actively ignoring the real essence of what it is that you're trying to study, which is the psychedelic effect itself. They're trying to substitute the importance of the psychedelic effect with importance of what's going on in the brain when a person is tripping, and the validity of that move is very questionable, I think.
Oh, it very much is. It's kind of depressing to hear that in a certain way, that's kind of the main celebrated stance at the moment in I don't know, academic funding.
Yeah. And it's also, that's academic funding, but that also leaks into the more less academic pop psychedelia thing, because someone like Robin Carhart-Harris, he will talk at highly prestigious scientific events, but he will also talk at the conferences that are just full of psychedelic hippies, like Breaking Convention. So he's he doesn't mind where he kind of puts himself. He's not trying to protect anything in that regard.
Yeah, and it plays into like a larger kind of, I don't know, reverence people have for people in the hard sciences.
Right. Yes.
In our I think in our culture generally in the West, there's this kind of like, I can just imagine how he's received at psychedelics conferences by some of the crowd, as a kind of like, here's like the truth of the matter sort of thing. Here's the science,
Exactly, and that's. It's an unexamined viewpoint, and so much of what we're talking about relies on assumptions not being examined and not being critiqued. And I think that our role in all of this is to point out what people are assuming that they don't actually say, because they go about doing all this elaborate theorizing and talking around the subject of psychedelia, but they never say what their core foundational assumptions are. And for me, that's something that the ego death theory really got me starting to think about. Michael Hoffman talks about assumption sets and innate assumption frameworks that are then systematically reconfigured in the light of transformational psychedelic experiences. So I would have thought naively that crowds of psychedelic people are really well aware of what their assumptions are. But the experience that I have had of pop psychedelic theorizing, conferences, writing, that kind of thing, it shows me that these people are not. They would much rather go along with pre-established assumption sets rather than trying to critique those and think about new assumptions, which it frustrates me, because it seems to me that was exactly what psychedelics did to me. That's even what the word psychedelia means. When you really analyze what that word, it means mind revealing, which I think another way of saying that is to say assumption revealing. They reveal what you had been assuming that you didn't notice you had been assuming, such as the fact that you have free will. You go through life assuming that your free will is real, and then suddenly you realize that you've been assuming that all along and that you were wrong about that, but that's when it's already too late, when you're in the middle of ego death experience or whatever.
Yeah, then you've got a lot of other problems, like like you were talking about the trust issue. Yeah, that's a great way to put it, that it reveals what you're assuming. And so it is kind of shocking that when people glob onto just any old set of, assumption set or paradigm or way of describing the psychedelic experience, or what their role should be or could be in society, or their history, that's what their history is and who used them in the past and what their societal kind of setup for consuming psychedelics was.
Well, that's another huge area, yeah.
Yeah, so, another topic I wanted to just make mention of was the kind of still building on what we were saying about the free will, no free will kind of positions in modern science and philosophies. One thing that it kind of took me a little while to grasp really about the ego death theory was it's like we're preserving in a way. We're preserving in a way. We're both preserving no free will and free will. It's about having both operating systems in a way available to the mind.
Right. Yeah.
It's not about staking out a claim that, free will doesn't exist and is a pure epiphenomenon, because it obviously subjectively exists in some sense of that word. This gets into whole ontology. There's all this ontology, epistemology stuff. That's not as interesting to me, but obviously people experience themselves as free will control agents some of the time, and then under the influence of psychedelics, they stop experiencing themselves that way.
But would you also say that experience of suddenly not being a control agent somehow feels more real than the previous experience of being a control agent, right?
Yes, definitely. Well, yes, that's for sure. It definitely feels more real, and yeah, I would agree with that entirely. I don't mean to say that somehow free will is also real in a certain way. It's illusory, but it's a convenient illusion that we can hold on to afterwards in some sense. It's been modified. But yeah, there's certainly a very strong sense, I feel, in the altered state that what you're experiencing is real. This is what drives some people mad who are not interested in the altered state when, about claims made by psychedelicists that, that it's real, and people look at it and say, well, you're crazy because you just took a drug, but.
And when they say it's real, they tend to mean physically real, because their concept of reality is governed by their assumption of materialism or physicalism. So people talk about things like encountering alien intelligences and seeing landscapes and that kind of thing, and talking about, is that real? That's not the kind of real that you mean when you're talking about whether the psychedelic experience is real. It's more like what it does to your concept of reality rather than what you actually experience being real or unreal. It changes how you understand the concept of reality and unreality rather than showing you something that's real necessarily.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It immediately makes me think of the image from Plato's Republic on the cave imagery, which is something we could unpack for a while. I assume you're familiar from your philosophy studies with the cave analogy.
I wrote this paper called Cognitive Phenomenology of Mind Manifestation. Did I ever show that to you? I can't remember.
I think I've read it, actually. I think you did share it with me, yes. We should dig that up.
And I've done a couple of presentations on it as well at different conferences, and some of those are on the internet. They're actually under my real name, so you have to use a bit of initiative to actually find them. But I actually use the idea of Plato's cave explicitly in both the talks and the paper. There's a whole section in the paper where I describe Plato's cave analogy and then say exactly how that works as an analogy for psychedelic experiencing.
Great. Okay, so you've already done it. Yeah, excellent. Excellent, because it's really amazing, because it's not so much that that analogy to me speaks very clearly to the what you just said about finding it changes your understanding of what the nature of reality even is.
Right. So even though you go back into the cave after you've had the experience, but you don't forget the fact that you realize that it is a cave and that it's not how you first conceived it. But that doesn't change the fact that you've got to continue living in it. So you have to, in a way, go back to the old paradigm, go back to egoic free will paradigm, but you've now got the memory of this transcendent paradigm in your mind, which then comes into play every time you re-enter the altered state.
Yeah, that's one of the key, we could devote a whole lot of time talking about this, but that's one of the key kind of problems that Plato explores in that text, is how do you make the kind of true philosopher, not in a modern philosopher, but the kind of true philosopher, how do you force them back into dealing with issues in the cave? Should you even do that? How do you, how does that work? How do you make them care about that afterwards? Is that even worthwhile? His Republic is this kind of grand thought experiment in figuring out how to relate altered state insight to society.
Right.
This whole construction of an ideal city, which is in some ways just a reflection of how the soul or mind is arranged.
That's one of the great insights that I've got from your writing, independently from Michael Hoffman's writing, was about the Republic and the idea of the ideal city-state. I had never realised, it never clicked in my mind that analogy between two idealised models of city-states corresponds to the idea of egoic mind and the transcendent mind. And then you wrote a blog post about it, and I thought that's bang on. That's exactly right.
Yeah, there's a lot of really profound stuff to be done in terms of reinterpreting kind of Greek political theory once you understand that it's all kind of an analogy for, or in some way influenced by, by altered state control dynamics, the dynamics of control between the local source and the ultimate source, how that's revealed in the altered state. All the kind of political arrangements that we've inherited, really, are the concepts behind them are in the Greek thinking are fundamentally influenced by altered state dynamics of who should be in charge, how does that get worked out, what should be the focus of society. So there's a lot of really kind of profound stuff to be done in terms of reinterpreting Plato and other thinkers from the Greeks, other writers from the Greeks about those arrangements. I mean, that speaks more to my own kind of personal historical interests in reinterpreting those things. And I don't really know how much real call there is for that sort of stuff in this podcast, but it nonetheless could be some use. I've been coming out of, finishing up this dissertation, which has required me kind of against my best efforts to go in, extremely specifically on one topic, kind of touching on what we said before about the issues of academia and how academia is almost set up to prevent the kind of field crossing of the ego death theory. But so as I'm kind of approaching the end of that writing process, I'm starting to reconsider what my efforts in terms of being all my training in the study of ancient history and Greek and Latin literature and the intellectual history, how those efforts can be best put to use. Is it worth kind of, right now I've been pursuing this extremely detailed project on one, part of one work, but it seems like like a lot of my efforts could almost be better spent on kind of pushing, mapping out in more detail the kind of a number of different spheres of kind of the ancient Greek and Roman thought world in a way, and pushing kind of like leaving the seeds for future researchers in terms of what's to be done in Plato, what's to be done with, Homer, what's to be done with Virgil, all these people.
So really your work is involving the entheogen theory of culture quite specifically.
Yes, I don't really consider myself much of an entheogen historian, in the sense of most of the books that are available on kind of psychedelics in the past. I don't really consider myself as working in that realm. I've written a few things identifying in the past, identifying psychedelics and mushrooms, for example, in various places, but I've almost kind of like made an effort not to focus on just finding entheogens in classical artwork and literature, just for my own thinking, trying to keep my thinking from just focusing on almost that trap of just looking for evidence of plants, and instead looking for evidence of the altered state. And now I don't need to find evidence of the altered state. Now it's kind of like, well, what do you do with it once we know that the altered state is a fundamental backdrop? I'm relatively convinced of that the altered state was a fundamental backdrop for Greek and Roman culture and thinking. Kind of what do you do with that? So that's where I kind of consider myself working. Sorry, go on.
You've adopted this particular idea as an axiom of your thinking, that everywhere you look in ancient sources, you're seeing something that was inspired by the altered state and determinism.
Yes, and that experience, and even when there's not even, there's nary a whiff of a mushroom depicted or anything like that. There's kind of the range of possible evidence. I mean, I keep talking this way in evidence because I'm still kind of thinking in the sense of like, needing to prove it to people who aren't convinced that the ancients were influenced by the altered state. But really, even places where there's, to return to my point, even places where there's no mushrooms evident, nonetheless, the altered state is there. The dynamics of control are depicted or woven in some way. Now, of course, there's potentially elements of society like economics or something. I don't even really know. There's areas of the field that are, even after years of studying it, are still new to me because of, when you're trying to study the classics, it's so broad. It's like trying to learn everything about two cultures that existed for, say, 2,000 years or so, across the whole Mediterranean. So, in some ways I'm like overwhelmed by the amount of potential material that I could discuss, and where, I've been trying to figure out recently where best to devote my kind of historical, linguistic, language, literature focus. And yeah, I'm not really sure what you think. I mean, how relevant this is to the aims of this podcast. I think that certainly in terms of pop psychedelia, the kind of entheogen historians are worth devoting some time to and critiquing, because they help shape in a way what other researchers and other figures, what their assumptions are about the history and use of these of psychedelics. And very oftentimes they're presenting an extremely distorted picture. Even the ones who have the best of intentions are often kind of limiting themselves and misportraying evidence.
Are you thinking of anyone in particular?
Yeah, really all of them in a way. So
Ruck.
So Carl Ruck is, yeah. I mean, Carl Ruck is someone I've wanted to devote more study to, because he's kind of the main person in the field of classics, of Greek and Roman studies, who has had to devote his career to it, and his thinking and modeling over time has somewhat changed, but. Yeah, I'm influenced by Michael Hoffman's kind of ordering of dividing out of theories into a kind of minimal entheogen theory of religion, a moderate, and a maximal.
Absolutely, yeah.
And Ruck falls into this moderate, and it is an interesting place. There are interesting dynamics of how he presents the evidence and what he chooses to focus on, how he does it. So he tends to act like, well, there's a ton of evidence, but at the same time he'll say, but it was only used by certain few groups. And so it becomes this like quasi-occult, quasi-elitist thing that even at the same time, his books have gotten more and more broad as time has gone on. And so I think he's got a book on entheogens and consciousness, or entheogens and all of classical mythology. So he's prepared to admit that entheogens are everywhere at this point.
But the more that he does that, the more that he pushes in that direction of broadening the scope of where you can identify entheogens, the more that his overall picture starts to look like a blatant self-contradiction. Because what he's saying is, absolutely everybody everywhere knew about entheogens and was tripping, but it was all a secret and nobody really knew about it. But which one of those is true?
Yeah, and I think he's dealing. He's dealing with I mean, there's a few things. One, I suspect that he was too influenced by R. Gordon Wasson at an early stage, because it was Wasson who... Yeah, I really don't know Ruck's history, how he got first involved in the Road to Eleusis project, what his specialty was before. Had he already been looking for this evidence? Had he already encountered it? I'm not really certain. It'd be interesting to try to speak with him.
Have you had any contact with him? Because I know Michael Hoffman has, but have you?
No, I haven't. I've taken... Yeah, that's another topic. My own contact with lots of scholars has been rather minimal in a lot of ways, which is something I should probably address more. But over the years, I've been so focused on kind of making my own way in academia. And partly, yeah, I don't know. No, I haven't. I really haven't.
But it certainly seems like, for you... Ruck is a kind of... Ruck ought to know about your work and what you're doing, because it's so similar.
And I think because from a very early date I was so influenced by Hoffman's critique of the moderate theory and how most of the books are kind of limiting themselves and shooting themselves in the foot, that I was kind of holding off from contacting them and being too influenced by them. Or, I remember I communicated with David Hillman at one point, the author of The Chemical Muse, and I kind of asked him, well, how should I approach working on this? And the suggestions I got weren't really that inspiring to me. It was kind of like, well, you should do a thesis looking at the Greek medical writers or the Greek writings on botany, which is fine, but my aims have always been to go straight for my aims have usually been to go straight for the heart of classical literature, of kind of the major authors. You saw in that paper I wrote, one of them was about the author Virgil, who is considered the kind of the foremost Roman author, and still there's a good chance people random people might have read some of the Aeneid or something like that. So to me, that's the real kind of prize and real target, the kind of where if you can, attack those, you can help flip the discipline over, basically. I've been publishing things about the historian Herodotus on my blog and deciphering his work according to ego-death dynamics. And so the idea of just like focusing on Greek botany authors wasn't super appealing to me. It doesn't have a lot of kind of like profundity of like, look at what's people have been reading this text for a long time in the modern era, and they've been completely missing out on this stuff. The botany stuff, it's like obvious. Okay, well, he says like mandrake is something that we put in wine or something like that. Like that doesn't have the same sort of like explosive power, basically.
And Hillman was too focused on more like soporific drugs like opium, and less about the real kind of psychedelic entheogen type drugs.
Right, yeah, which are, in fact, the explicit evidence for is the kind of named evidence for is harder, basically, than they're very explicit about, yes, opium, the medical authors, for example, it's all over the place. Opium is mentioned with, there's no doubt about that.
Except that the nomenclature system didn't exist then. So how do you know that? Is it because of pictures of the plants? Like, they didn't have these paired Latin names. That's only a fairly recent convention in history.
Right. That's true. So how do you deal with identifying botanical? Yeah. So that is possible that we have misidentified. Scholars have misidentified the plants under discussion. That's possible. Sometimes they are accompanied by images, so I think that could be potentially explosive. I'm not at this stage. I'm not very well versed in the kind of botanical text, so I shouldn't kind of poo-poo them. But my own, just to clarify, my own interest has been in kind of like the great classical literature sort of vibe, and exploding those as fully entheogenic and ego-death oriented.
Because I'm particularly curious with Tom Hatsis, this writer who's come out recently, about how he grapples with that issue of plant identification before the modern system of naming plants, because that's obviously so relevant to what he writes. You were kind of questioning whether or not what you're talking about, the role of entheogens in Greek and Roman culture and in Greek Roman literature, whether or not it's relevant to this podcast and relevant to the project of critiquing pop psychedelia. And I wanted to comment on that because to earlier on in the podcast, I was really listing the paradigms and going through them. So we had the neuroscience paradigm, psychotherapy, New Age, woo-woo, that kind of thing. And I think we're identifying another one here, which is probably a bit less prominent, at least in what I've experienced of pop psychedelia. But it's the religion and history paradigm, trying to talk about where entheogens fit into religion and history. And I think that's very important, because this is where the distinction between minimal, moderate, and maximal becomes the most relevant and the most obvious, is when you're talking about the historical role of entheogens. And the writers that we have listed, so for example, you mentioned Dan Merkur, we talked about Wasson and Ruck. They're very, I think they're fully pop psychedelia writers. They exemplify pop psychedelia paradigms. And one thing that really stood out to me at the last Breaking Convention conference was that there's a bookstore, always. It's run by the same guy. I've seen him at a number of different psychedelic conferences, but they have got all the relevant pop psychedelia books all on one big display. And I noticed that they have, so they have Carl Ruck's books about Christianity, mythology, entheogens, that kind of thing. Clark Heinrich, his books about Amanita. You've got Dan Mercur's books, which cover entheogens in rabbinical Judaism and ancient Christianity, not just at the origin of Christianity, but also in the ongoing history of Christianity. You've got books by people like Scott Tetzworth, and I think you've written about Tetzworth's book on your blog. It was called Krishna in the Sky with Diamonds, and it was all about...
Oh, yeah. I became aware of it. Yeah, I haven't looked at it yet, but I saw it. Quite interesting.
I picked up that book. It's pretty forward thinking. It's connecting entheogens to Hinduism in a very explicit way. You've also got writers like Wasson, who wrote about Buddhism and how the entheogenic influences of Buddhism. So what really struck me about that was you've got these different books all placed next to each other, which say Christianity is entheogenic, Judaism is entheogenic, Islam is entheogenic, but nobody is saying the obvious further logical step from that, which Michael Hoffman has identified, which is that religion itself is, and mythology itself is inherently entheogenic. So it's like they've got all the puzzle pieces laid out right next to each other in the form of these various different books by Mercur, Ruck, Tetzworth, etc., but they're not progressing beyond that and saying, oh, well, this means that basically there's no big world religion that doesn't have some evidence of entheogenic influence or origin behind it. And it strikes me as very blind, stunted thinking that they're not realizing that. And Michael Hoffman has already provided the forward step in that regard by bringing all of these different ideas together under the broad banner of the maximal entheogen theory of religion, and they haven't caught on to that yet. But in terms of you were asking if it's relevant to what we're doing in this podcast, as far as I can tell, it absolutely is. Except that some of what you write on your blog is it's about quite obscure literary references, quite obscure Greek and Roman writings, and perhaps that doesn't kind of open it up as broadly, but it's all relevant at the end of the day, I think.
Yeah. I mean, as you're talking, I realize how relevant it is in the sense of saying that all religion and all kind of cultural practices that we've, a lot of cultural practices initiated or kind of influenced heavily by Greek culture, for example, in Western society. It is extremely relevant to reveal how those are entheogenic or altered state based or influenced at some stage. I think that I've been so, immersed in the world of professional research on these topics that sometimes I lose sight of what, precisely of communicating those to, communicating the relevance of that, because of course it's obvious to me to talk about an obscure story in the historian Herodotus, like that. From my point of view, having lived in academia, it's kind of like, well, of course that's relevant. The king of Lydia in 542 BC is super relevant, but I think that's one thing I hope to kind of grow out of this is learn from doing this podcast is to I guess better address a wider audience, one who is less concerned with some of the details of ancient history, and more concerned with a lot of the takeaway. I've been writing in a way for myself, or other people who are studying ancient literature in depth, to show how every sentence can be deconstructed or interpreted in light of eternalism, cybernetic dynamics, and mythological references.
But you said the sources you use start to become obscure from the point of view of mass audiences.
Yeah, it's it's almost like I've lost sight of the what I was saying. My original goal was striking at the heart of some of the classical literature. It's just over time I've lost sight of what actually that is to most people.
Right.
Which is just a funny dynamic. I'm just laughing because it's a funny dynamic of academic kind of contemporary academics, which is kind of like another tangential issue that in a way underpins a lot of these topics is the system of academia as it stands and the way that it promotes careerist thinking and specifically, focusing in on specific disciplines and to the exclusion of everything else, and mining down into just one little topic. So that seems like a kind of like meta topic that stretches across a lot of these.
Right, about how the academic system shuts out paradigm conversion.
Yeah, and in a way almost like prevents people from recognizing that they are becoming locked into a kind of assumption set.
Oh, I see. Yeah, so they get carried away with this extremely strained kind of the way they write, focusing on very small details and writing at great length, and really focusing on the details and getting everything rigorous. They're really losing sight of the bigger picture in that way.
Yeah, and it's a question of who the audience is, I guess. And so one reason I've been excited about working on this collaboration is learning to address people who aren't in the kind of audience I've been trained to write for in academia. Now I have a certain audience I've developed on my blog, which is kind of me basically, and a few other people like yourself. But what I publish on the blog is very much kind of for classical literary scholars in a lot of ways.
Yeah, especially more recently, I think.
Yeah, but I think that's right. That's interesting to learn that at a lot of the pop psychedelia conferences, there are all those entheogen history books are prevalent
next to each other.
Rock, Heinrich, Merkur,
Wasson, Tetsworth,
yeah, where it would be from my point of view. Now, from my point of view, all those books are attempts or first attempts. And something you said earlier about how people latch onto a paradigm and then don't really do much. I don't know. Don't really question it that much. Even in pop psychedelia, people do that.
Yes.
I think that's very relevant to the entheogen history people, because you see authors making the same kind of moves again and again in terms of what they even consider to be evidence.
They're stuck in the 70s to a large extent. They're limited by Allegro. Allegro really set that whole thing up in the first place, and I think that a lot of these modern writers have merely kind of tried to follow on from Allegro, but sticking too much to his original way of seeing things. And I think his motivations were all wrong. He was trying to attack and discredit Christianity rather than constructively theorize about the origins of religion.
Yeah. So there's a huge influence of Allegro and of Wasson, as we mentioned earlier.
And also because it's inherently moderate, the focus seems to be, in particular with people like Ruck, is to find physical plants, find depictions of physical entheogens. Whereas from the point of view of the ego death theory paradigm, the physical entheogen themselves is only incidentally important. The only reason it's important is because it triggers the loosened cognitive state, which then reveals eternalism. And that's the core point. So these moderate writers like Ruck and Wasson, they only look for entheogens rather than looking for the cognitive state.
Yeah, it's like they don't get the cognitive state. They haven't thought as much about that, and so they look for the entheogens. Ruck, in some of his more recent books, has moved into asking questions about a cognitive state or about consciousness. But I have the impression it's kind of his own kind of homegrown sort of theorizing based in his understanding of mythology, which isn't as kind of clear or specific as the ego death theory's interpretation of mythology as analogy for control dynamics. So if you read some of his more recent books, it's this very vague kind of grasp of consciousness or of the dynamics of the altered state.
But do you think that Ruck is suggesting that mythology is reflecting or analogizing the altered state? Has he got that far?
Well, I would have to look at the book I'm thinking of again to get the exact quotation. But I think yes, I think he is at that stage.
But presumably, he wouldn't mention determinism. I doubt he would be.
Yes, that's a big element missing. Yeah, there's no sense that the core dynamics of the experience center around eternalism and determinism and free will, etc. So, and that's the largest thing missing, I think, from all the entheogen history books is an actual grasp of those dynamics.
But are you familiar with the book called Hellenistic Religion?
That book was, yeah, that's a great book by Luther H. Martin.
He talks about determinism in that book.
He does, and the mystery religions of the Hellenistic period, so to speak, the period after Alexander the Great, kind of spread Greek culture all over the Eastern Mediterranean, that those mystery religions were centrally concerned with the problems of reconciling the individual with the fated universe.
Right.
And so that book I think I really recommend that book and have taken great inspiration from it. It's kind of an introductory text, but it covers all all the major mystery religions of the period, including Christianity and Gnosticism, but also things like the Mithras religion and the Isis and other Greco kind of Greek or Egyptian styled or Persian styled mystery cults.
It's good because they often focus so heavily on Eleusis and this one particular mystery cult to the expense of all the others. But at least Martin is broader in his recognition of how broad the field of mystery religion actually was. But that is by no means an entheogen history book, and I don't think he mentions drugs or the altered state in that book.
Yeah, I can't recall. There's a few scholars. I think he might mention it in a footnote, and he's not entirely dismissive, basically. But I think he just mentions the Road to Eleusis. For some reason, the Road to Eleusis is the only entheogen book, usually the only entheogen book that is mentioned by mainstream academics, of which Martin is one. He's a scholar of ancient religion. Right. At an American university. I think Michael Ranella's book Pharmacon is starting to get some more play in the kind of footnote world. But these things really need, one of the points is these things really need to move out of the footnotes and need to be kind of central concern for scholars and just entheogen history. Not these entheogen history books need to move out of the footnote and need to be fully taken on and considered, and not just one at a time, but as you're suggesting, as a whole group.
Yes.
Because at a certain point, we've got to flip over from this narrative of here I'm revealing the hidden entheogens in this one tradition,
right,
and flip over into saying that the whole thing, as Michael Hoffman has already done. That's what I'm kind of impatient about. People need to flip over out of this micro revelation of entheogens into just stating it front and center that, making the case and stating it front and center that all religions worldwide have their origins and continuing kind of inspiration from psychedelics.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned this tactic of relegating things to footnotes and perhaps introductions or minimalizing the importance. I think that's a very crucial weapon in the arsenal of this kind of force of ignorance that tries to block out paradigm conversion, is relegating things to footnotes. And it made me think of, are you familiar with Luke Timothy Johnson? He's written about Christianity. He's written about mysticism in Christianity. There's one great, he does a series of audio lectures by the Teaching Company about the Book of Revelations. And right at the beginning, he says, the Book of Revelations is absolutely not the rambling of some guy on a drug trip. And then
really?
And then he goes on from there to go into all this detail about Revelations and everything, but he's safely confined this crucial point to the very beginning. To get that out of the way as quick as possible, it's not all about tripping. You can only express the truth if you do it in negation. You have to put the word "not" before it. And that's certainly what he's done there, and also put it in the footnotes, put it in the introduction, get it out the way so that people don't put too much attention on it.
Yeah, no, don't worry about when the author of Revelation describes himself eating little scrolls. Don't worry about that. That's that is certainly not an entheogen. Yeah, that's fascinating. But it goes to show some of the games, it's why I think you mentioned earlier about Michael Hoffman seems more optimistic than maybe the way we talk about it in terms of the uptake of the ego death theory.
Yes.
And I think that he's very sensitive to those sorts of games that people have to play in their publishing and in their writings and things like that. He doesn't describe anyone in detail, but he does make reference to presses that he knows through personal communication, that presses that have both editors, the whole press, or that authors themselves, censor themselves.
Right.
And play these sorts of games. So it's kind of, does Luke Timothy Johnson intend us by opening with that sort of, it certainly is not about drugs or not influenced by drugs. Does he in fact intend to communicate with those of us who do think it's about drugs that, he agrees with us and is just having to play this prohibitionist game?
Exactly, yeah.
I don't know. It leaves it open. It's like, I don't know. Who knows? It's an open thing.
And I think maybe it also appeals to finer psychological notions like conscious realization versus unconscious. Is he consciously aware of that, or is he unconscious? I don't know. Maybe that's not relevant. But is it just the pressure of his professional responsibilities that causes him to cloak the truth behind this negation and this kind of dismissive attitude? Who knows?
Yeah.
Because there's another instance of that. When I was doing PhD research, the major philosophical textbook that I was constantly encountering was a book called Perceiving God by William Alston, who's a very highly esteemed scholar. And he's got this concept in that book called overriders, where you can talk about mystical experience and whether a mystical experience is genuine or fake, or whether it's like a false prophecy or something like that. And the concept of overrider is like a catch-all concept which will eliminate the validity of certain experiences. And so Alston himself doesn't mention drugs as being an overrider, but my professor, who I've mentioned, was a devout Catholic and made no... she didn't waste any time telling me that she was a devout Catholic, even though it was, the context of a PhD research meeting. But anyway, she said at one point, mystical experiences are not genuine if there's an overrider which will disprove their validity. And she's like, so maybe if it was an illness or if it was drugs, and she slipped in the word drugs. I hadn't mentioned anything about it, but she said, so again, it makes me wonder, do these academics know on some unconscious or semi-conscious level, but they have to deny it on the conscious, open, public level? They have to deny it, but they do mention it, but they just put the word not or overrider, some kind of further concept which only serves to eliminate the validity of this thing, and they use that as a weapon against entheogens.
Yeah, there's a lot of these sort of entheogen diminishment habits in academia that are, to a certain extent, in my experience, they're just kind of learned phrases. Like so much of succeeding, it seems to me, in contemporary academia is about learning habits of talk. It's not so. I mean, it certainly involves sophisticated research and writing well and things like that, but it. To a large extent, like succeeding in academia involves learning how to perform in certain ways.
So how to play the game.
Yeah, how to play the game and how to play the game, for sure. You have to perform in all these different contexts. I mean, I think there's this kind of popular idea that, academics are out there as truth seekers and things like that. But to a large extent, to establish themselves in their careers, they have to learn to play the game, as you said. They have to learn to do certain things and say certain things, that other ways of behaving and certain things to say are taboo and are not, you can't talk about them openly and directly.
Right. So really, it's almost, you could say the academic game is a form of imitation or parroting. You're trying to learn to imitate a certain style.
Yes, I very much think so. And you can see some of this in you mentioned Tom Hatsis earlier.
Oh, he tries to imitate academics.
It's very funny from my point of view, having spent a lot of time amongst the sorts of people that Hatsis claims to be kind of one of, this kind of historical scholars and language scholars of Greek and Latin and things like that. And so I see, it's very obvious to me what he's doing when he's, denigrating people like Jan Irvin and other Allegro and people like that for I don't know, for not applying the correct rules of historical methodology. It's like, come on. Like,
you see that he's doing this kind of mimicking.
There's this kind of mimicking. There's a sort of play that there's this kind of like, I don't know. One of my professors described it to me as like scholarship as a contact sport sort of thing, where you're like, which is a kind of great analogy because it gets in there this idea that it's a game, which of course I don't think it is at all, but people, to me it's something I've always treated as something serious, and that like we've got to like spread something that's true, or not true, but like something that's important and serious, and then that it's kind of, you have a go at attacking your opponent and dressing down your opponent and things like that using whatever, but this then leads to really distorted people making these really distorted positions. Like you were saying, like your Catholic professor saying like, well, mysticism is not legitimate if it has these overriders or something like that. But like,
if it's caused by drugs or mental illness, that fact makes the experience irrelevant and not legitimate, not genuine.
Somehow not a genuine religious experience or something like that. The sort of very conservative view of, conservative in the sense of limiting, limiting what's acceptable.
Right, yeah. Which is always anti-drugs.
Yeah, which is also happens to line up just fine with, kind of economic and social interests of a prohibitionist culture.
Right.
So all this stuff gets implicated together. I mean, I don't know. There's lots of... I mean, to return to Hatsis for a moment, because he's kind of like new on the scene in a way, and his approach is worth deconstructing to a certain extent. I mean, to a certain extent, Michael's already kind of covered all this.
Yes, he has, yeah. But that's inevitable with what we're doing anyway, that we're going to cover a lot of ground that has already been covered by Michael Hoffman. It's certainly worth doing it.
I think that's right. I think it's worth, it's worth doing. It's worth just having other people discussing the topics and seeing what we come up with.
Yeah.
I'm not like convinced that I have a ton to contribute in terms of development of the theory development, so to say. I don't think that I have a whole lot to really add to that, because it seems so. I mean, I think the analogy used at the beginning about the martial arts style, that there's a distinctive Michael Hoffman style that is, and so the theory is very distinctly kind of his creation, and, in a way we're just providing more discussion of it and more kind of discussion of other topics from its perspective, going into more detail, kind of mapping out more of the terrain of the paradigm.
Exactly. As far as theory development goes, I wouldn't have any idea what direction to push it in, and I trust that to Michael Hoffman to do the necessary work. And yeah, what we're doing, we're first generation adopters, and we're taking it forward and using it as a framework for our discussion and our continued narrative. Very interesting thing about Hatsis is that I feel with his writing, it splits into two separate domains. There's the overt thing that he's saying, and then there's a covert subtext behind what he's saying. And I find that the covert subtext that he doesn't state explicitly is more interesting than the information that he's trying to present on the overt level. And what that covert subtext is about is a kind of paradigm clash between the official academic paradigm and the internet. And he's very sensitive about distinguishing those two. Like he says in interviews, don't trust everything you say everything that you hear on the internet. And I think a lot of his diatribe against Jan Irvin also follows from that. He sees Jan Irvin as, that's an internet scholar, that's not real. And then he said to me in communication, like, I'm a real scholar, I'm part of the real academic world, and Jan Irvin is just a fake internet scholar, whatever. And it's that distinction between internet scholarship versus real life scholarship.
Right.
But obviously from our point of view, none of this would be happening. The ego death theory, we would never have been able to hear about it had it not been for the effect of internet scholarship or the internet platform and the new freedom that opened up to the world. So in that way, I think it disproves Hatsis. He seems to feel that the internet is bad and the academy is good, and the internet just is going wrong, getting everything wrong. in the way that Jan Irvin might be doing, but then you've got to look to academics to go to get the truth. And he massively looks up to people like Carl Ruck as standing above his work and being the people who are in a position to judge and critique his work. So if he would never take anything we said about his work seriously. I actually...
because we don't have the trappings of authority, basically.
Exactly. He actually said, I sent him a message on Facebook saying about how you and Hoffman had written about his work, and he wrote back saying, "Oh my God, a blogger has an opinion about my work." And he wrote the word blogger in capital letters and then exclamation mark, as if I would take a blogger seriously. And I was thinking, but mate, you are a blogger. Like, that's how I first found out about his work, was because he runs this blog that's actually quite interesting. It's called Ars Psychedelia. It's come on and offline, but he's got some semi-interesting essays on there about Leary and about Karl Ruck and the salamander, art in religious history, that kind of thing. So... he's a blogger, so there seems to be a great
it's very interesting. Like you were just saying, hypocrisy. Yeah, no, I agree. There's this kind of strange dynamic where he's using the internet as much as he can, but doing all these kind of games that I guess he learned in his time in academia, to disparage other researchers on the internet.
Right, exactly.
And other researchers in this like tiny little world of people publishing in entheogen history. Yeah, he's like crashing around in it.
As if he thinks that his limited experience and achievement in academia somehow sets him apart from the internet scholars, but I don't really see a good basis for that.
Yeah, it's like it's just an argument from authority that ignores the kind of all the social conditions of contemporary academia,
right,
and the compromises that those social conditions very frequently place on people's paradigms and tactics of interpretation. So much of that is so influenced by the prohibitionist culture that we have grown up in that they become almost invisible to people. And I have discussions with people who are very very critical. They're like, activists in various fields in the U.S. who are very critical of contemporary society in a lot of ways, but they still reflect this kind of, there's these unconscious assumptions about drug usage and drug users that even when I point out to them, I'm like, no, this is a prohibitionist paradigm. They say, no, it's not, kind of thing. Like, I'm not disparaging drug users. Drug users are fine. But then there's all these kind of incidental comments that get made and kind of, drug prohibition is not that important to fight. I've had to like really stand up for the kind of, amongst this kind of like activist community, really stand up for fighting prohibition as a really central part of, almost defend it to other activists and their concerns when it seems obvious to me that it's an important, relevant feature of contemporary society that causes, all sorts of things people might be interested in. It's related to economic features, it's related to racial oppression, it's related to a lot of different things. The most important of which is, of course, like the freedom of religion, freedom to alter one's consciousness, and things like that. But it's just fascinating to me the extent of it. It shows how pervasive I think prohibitionist assumptions have become, and kind of unexamined and even people who consider themselves radical or working in a radical field like entheogen history can still replicate ways of thinking that come from a prohibitionist paradigm.
So it's exactly what we were saying about assuming things but not noticing consciously what you're assuming. And this is we've identified this as a major obstacle to pop psychedelic understanding, is that there's a blindness to the way that the prohibitionist mentality influences thinking. And there's so much more we could cover about this. The various ways that prohibitionist mentality creeps into modern thinking, where it tries to tackle subjects like religion, spirituality, and entheogens. It is coloured by prohibitionist assumptions that it doesn't notice.
Definitely. Just to link that back just briefly to give an example of Hatzis's work, his critiquing of Jan Irvin, his critiquing of the allegro and the entheogenic basis for Christianity, or continued throughout the Middle Ages and Renaissance, really, or like influence of entheogens, his critique is based in, say, oh, there isn't good evidence for it, and we can apply, certain methods from historical research to judge the evidence. But he seems not to question how, what counts as evidence, that what counts as evidence is so influenced by our prohibitionist mindset, which looks and says, no, there are no drugs kind of anywhere except in deviant circles and things like that.
That's a major aspect of, I mentioned in the last recording about how Michael Hoffman's theory, it doesn't only tell you what to think, but it also tells you how to think. And in that regard of that you don't notice certain things about your thinking until you adopt the ego death theory paradigm. And Hatsis is certainly unaware of those aspects of his thinking.
but then so kind of, I don't know, laughable or interesting in his very vociferous sort of, I don't know, attacks on, I don't know, dividing out of the playground in a way. It puts Jan Irvin over in a corner and Allegro and us, bloggers or whatever, throwing rocks at them, goes to try to suck up to Karl Rock. Anyway, I don't want to spend all this time just critiquing Tom Hatzis's personal style, but it's
tempting to do that though, isn't it?
It's tempting to do that. It's also tempting for my background as someone who actually is about to get a PhD in Greek and Latin languages to see him running around saying that, well, he actually knows the languages and so is a better judge, and then actually looking up what his published academic credentials are, and they're not, he has I think a master's degree in history from, it's just funny because he asked to be judged in this sort of serious academic way. I've been trained to judge people in that way. I know how to judge people in that way and look at programs and stuff like that. It's
right.
Not, I'm very critical of this whole paradigm, but he's asking to be judged in that way, and I don't understand how any established academic in the kind of mainstream academic world would look at his credentials and take him seriously. If you're going to ask, if you want to play that authority game and that authority academic social game, it's weird to me that he wants to play that because he doesn't have those credentials. He doesn't have a PhD from a top-tier institution. He doesn't have an academic position anywhere. So it's bizarre to me that he wants to play that game and demand that we judge other entheogen scholars or whatever based upon those credentials. Because he doesn't have them. Those credentials don't really exist for entheogen scholars.
I think it demonstrates what I said earlier about how with Hatsis, the subtext is more important than the actual overt context. Because in all of this discussion, we've not really mentioned what he actually writes about. We're only talking about his motivations and the way that he postures and kind of tries to place himself as being among the academics against the internet scholars. But we haven't even mentioned. So, I mean, that's the kind of further thing. I was going to ask, actually, have you seen his book? Because I know at one point you expressed an interest in getting a copy of that book. And
I did. I did. I have a copy, but I haven't had the time to dip into it, and I really should. I think we to be fair to him, we should, perhaps we should critique the content as well, examine the content of his book on the witch's ointment, or I should do some sort of, if that's not appropriate for the podcast, I should do some sort of quick write-up on my blog about what he contributes to entheogen, history studies.
Yeah,
my impression is that it's focused on scopolamine plants, which is in fact a kind of understudied, I think, aspect of Christian or Western European entheogen history. Most of the focus has been on things like mushrooms or opium, as we mentioned earlier.
But scopolamine has always been the one that is more associated with witchcraft specifically, rather than... There's two very different focuses of Hatzis's work. One of them is talking about entheogens in religion. The other one is much more narrow, talking about entheogens in witchcraft. And that's what the book is about, right? It doesn't... Does the book even talk about... Well, you haven't read it yet, but I don't think...
I haven't read it. No, I've skimmed into parts of it that, there's a kind of focus on the rhetoric about these witchcraft ointments specifically, how witches were constructed or presented by the official Catholic inquisitorial rhetoric.
Right.
how they were presented. So there's potentially that would lead him potentially into material about what religion is, what counts as religion.
Right. Okay.
In the kind of in the kind of modern academic, there's kind of my own experience with religious studies in an academic context is that there's very slowly been a broadening understanding of what we count as religious, and that so-called magic, which has often been defined as something that is not religious or somehow different from religion, that in fact, historically, religion and magic we shouldn't distinguish so much between these two forms of these two activities, but they in fact share a lot of common assumptions, which of course the ego death theory would completely agree with that.
So in collapsing that distinction, you end up moving witchcraft closer to religion.
Yes, you end up moving it closer to religion in the academic sort of paradigm, the academic definitions. You move it closer. Now that's something that's been going on in mainstream academia for past 2 decades, probably, is my experience. But there's still a lot of, it hasn't trickled necessarily into an introductory textbook. Right, or into introductory thinking. So I would be interested to see from that perspective where Hatsis falls and what. But based on his other writings, it seems like he's completely opposed to the idea of a entheogenic Catholicism or entheogenic mainstream Christianity.
Yes, I mean he takes historicity of Jesus for granted, as far as I know from my communication with him. So he seems to lack an awareness of the potential role of entheogens in Christianity, and his whole outlook on it is very kind of debunkist and dismissive of it. And so he picks Jan Irvin as a target. And this is another instance of what I mentioned earlier about how the modern paradigm is really stuck in the 70s in terms of it limits its thinking around Allegro's initial, what he wrote in The Sacred Mushroom and the Cross. And I think that Hatsis falls into that trap of being too influenced by Allegro and not being able to move past that and build constructive theories that go beyond what Allegro said.
Yeah, which is very much. That reflects, I think, a lot of academic training is in, critiquing earlier scholars, which doesn't result then in creating something new or creating something constructive in a new way. It's kind of, students in high-level courses are often made to do that. It's a very student sort of thing. Like, write a critique of this scholar's article. That's something I've had to do countless times. It's like, write a critique of this scholar's article. What evidence do they bring? Is it good evidence? What assumptions do they make? It's kind of run-of-the-mill graduate study work or high-level undergraduate work, in my experience. But it doesn't lead to this kind of, constructive limit. It is limiting, as you're saying.
Because with Michael Hoffman, he does do a lot of that, critiquing older writers, but he does it from the point of view of this new paradigm that he's created. So there's a difference. He's not limiting himself when he focuses on the older writers, because he's using this newer, more up-to-date framework. Whereas if you're just critiquing...
Yeah, so he's not just critiquing, sorry to interrupt, but it's not just about kind of adopting the world model of that writer and then critiquing it. It's more about standing outside in your own world model.
Right.
And saying, well, look, you're missing out on this, that, and the other thing, and here's the real constructive work is, and here's how you can move closer to the world model that I am standing for.
Got it, yes.
That's a really constructive critique, is this, here's what you can do to come closer.
So I think that's what we should be focusing on in future episodes. I think from now on, we should get a bit more specific in our focus and start dissecting individual theories more closely and incorporating sound bites and quotes from people's theories in order to
that would be great.
Deconstruct.
Yeah, that would be great, and be able to have a bit more substantive sort of focus. So I think we've made some good categorizations here. So we just review what the kind of 4 or 5 paradigms that we've established.
So there's the psychotherapy one, Rick Doblin. And then there's the neuroscience with Carhart-Harris and Professor Nutt. There's the woo-woo New Age Martin Ball type paradigm, and then
like non-duality and energy.
Right.
Keywords. I'm thinking of just associating kind of keywords with them. Like psychotherapy is like emotion and the network of psychiatrists and treating diseases like PTSD, or not diseases. I don't know how, what the lingo is, but treating problems, abnormal conditions, I don't know, like PTSD, etc.
And just general emotional issues. And then finally, historical / anthropological / mythological theory, which tries to place entheogens into the historical context and talk about religion and mythology in entheogenic terms. So those four paradigms are the major conglomeration of thoughts and ideas that you observe in pop psychedelic paradigm. They all belong to one of those four. I don't think we've missed any in particular.
But the one I wanted to ask you about, whether it's a kind of legitimate final category or or if it just kind of stretches across. I mean, how much it shows up in pop psychedelia, but is kind of anti-prohibition activism. So that might. I just wonder if that's how much does that play in your experience in kind of pop psychedelic conferences? This kind of we need to reform the drug laws because they're obviously a failure and it's harming society. That sort of tact approach.
That's you're right. I hadn't thought about that. That's a distinctive paradigm, and it's really important to mention because it highlights a lot of really crucial assumptions that are at play, such as the role of bad trips. I think the anti-prohibition activism mentality has a real problem with the subject of bad trips. They can't integrate that. It's an embarrassment for them. They have to try and explain it away or try to say that bad trips are just something to be avoided, something like that.
Right.
It's uncomfortable for them to admit that there is this very wide open inherent possibility of freak-out panic attack, because it goes against the idea that psychedelics are safe and that and that they shouldn't be prohibited.
Mm-hmm.
It's based on the assumption that prohibition is based on drugs being dangerous in the first place, which itself is a hugely controversial and questionable assumption, and in fact downright false assumption, I think, from certain people.
It is. I don't know if you saw, there's been kind of making the rounds. I just commented it. One of my few actual comments on my Facebook, I commented on someone else, like some drug prohibition, anti-prohibition Facebook feed or something like that.
Oh, right.
But anyway, there's been making the rounds for some reason now, one of Nixon's top advisors, who apparently in the 90s, which is why I don't know why this is making the rounds now, but apparently in the 90s, he was being interviewed by some journalist near the end of his life and was feeling particularly confessional or something like that. And he just straight up said that, President Nixon's war on drugs was not about harm reduction. We just said that. It was about, attacking the anti-war hippies and attacking black people.
As if that wasn't obvious. I mean, it really demonstrates the crippling nature of unexamined assumptions, that you can go so wrong in your thinking by not looking at the foundations of your thought and making sure that those are all in order. And the foundation of the drug law reform, anti-prohibition mentality really squarely takes it for granted that prohibition is based in genuine, honest intentions to protect people from the dangerous harms of drugs. But that's so utterly false, and it seems so obvious that what Nixon's advisor is saying there is true. Of course, it was never about. It was all based in lies. In fact, it makes me want to point out something about. You and I, both when we were talking about our history of introduction to this, we talked about our drug use, and in particular cannabis. And I noticed you used the word marijuana, and I used the word cannabis. But cannabis is the correct word, right? Marijuana is just the Spanish word for Mary Jane, and it was calculated to put the a mental association with Mexican people. And that itself was... So even the word marijuana, which is the standard word... I think a lot of American people assume that marijuana is actually the word, but it's not. The real word is cannabis, which comes from the Sanskrit language. It means two forms, because cannabis is the only annual reproducing plant that has a male and a female. So cannabis actually means two forms. Marijuana is a racist slur that has entered into general language, again, because of like unexamined, unrealized issues relating to prohibition and the motivations behind prohibition.
It's funny because I, in fact, just yesterday when I was doing, a little bit of follow-up reading about this war on drug stuff, I saw, someone had said that, pointed that out exactly, and I immediately thought of, that's the word I tend to use. It never occurred to me, that is a prohibitionist term that I should kind of excise from my vocabulary and not kind of, in terms of, not buying into that whole paradigm. It never occurred to me that it comes out of this kind of 1920s, 1930s, the initial round of marijuana prohibition is an anti-Mexican thing.
And when we modern people look at things like, there's this great movie, what's it called? Oh, God. Woody Harrelson made this great movie all about the origins of cannabis prohibition. I can't remember what it's called. Mm-hmm. Anyway, we look now at the old prohibition that it used to show people smoking a joint and then picking up a gun and killing their friends or their family or whatever. We look at that now and it's a comedy, but they took it totally seriously at the time. And if you look at modern anti-drug propaganda, it's just as comical and just as ridiculous and false, but it's comes across in a way that the modern mind is able to accept. We wouldn't be able to accept being told such flat out lies as being told that cannabis makes you kill people. But it's just modern versions of the same lies, really. But that word marijuana and that original round of anti-drugs propaganda, around the same time that was coming out, they were saying in official propaganda, like newspapers, that cocaine made black people become bulletproof. Things like that. Things that are totally calculated to instill fear into certain mindset. And, the fact that so many people are so blind to such obvious thought manipulation and such obvious propagandizing. It's terrifying. Mm-hmm. And that is so persistent. Even, as we've just indicated, like even among you and I, like very sophisticated, advanced thinkers, this term marijuana just kind of gets thrown into conversation without really realizing the full ramifications of what that word, really means.
Yeah, its origins. I know, I was kind of, shocked to discover that. And kind of shocked at myself for being come on, you should, if you've taken an interest in this, you should know this sort of thing already. But But yeah, no, it really is a great example of the pervasiveness of that way of thinking and the effect it's had on language. I was thinking, that you were saying about the ads have gotten a little more sophisticated, even though they still seem comical. But, there's the modern version. I think I saw one a few years ago that was it's the scene is this teenager who's really upset because he or she or whatever is supposed to be babysitting the neighbor's kid, but then they smoked a joint, and while they're smoking a joint, the baby drowned in a pool or something like that. Right. This completely absurd scenario, and then it's don't do drugs sort of thing, and I'm it's 2010. How are people
People really haven't moved on as much as you would hope. In the course of you saying that, you actually reminded me what the name of that Woody Harrelson documentary was. It was called Reefer Madness. Because the term reefer madness is what they used to call cannabis reefer, or I don't exactly know what that means, but reefer madness, in the modern parlance, they have taken that term, reefer madness, and just substituted it with cannabis psychosis, which is just an exact parallel of the term reefer madness. And you hear that term cannabis psychosis all over British anti-drugs propaganda. You're constantly hearing about how cannabis makes people go psychotic.
Oh, really? Wow.
But again, it's the mental association with words like madness and psychosis and what emotions that rises in. For example, people who've got children who've never taken drugs themselves and they're terrified about what their children are going to do. It's very self-perpetuating negativity.
Yeah, it is. So I think that the kind of this prohibitionist paradigm, I think that's worth talking about, and that how does anti-prohibition or the phrase drug reform or drug policy reform or whatever,
Drug policy reform, yeah.
I think that's kind of the phrase that they settle on.
And that's the phrase Michael Hoffman uses, yeah, drug policy reform. And he has explicitly said how it's conceptually bankrupt or brainwashed. They're trying to be anti-prohibition, but their thinking is unconsciously based in prohibitionist assumptions. And this is certainly something that you and I ought to fully deconstruct and cover this with reference to real people who are actually expressing these ideas.
I think so, because then it tends to, what I've noticed is it tends to then infect or play a role in a lot of the other paradigms we've mentioned. I think it both exists as its own, because there are organizations out there dedicated to fighting prohibition, but to me that they're not as, they could use some like supercharging with something like, the entheogen history or just the ego death theory specifically.
Right.
They could use some bolstering in that way, because most of the arguments tend to be very, either buy into the prohibitionist mindset that drugs are a problem and we just need to, drugs are a problem, but the way we've been doing it, we've been doing the drug war is failing, and so we need to change the way we're doing the drug war, or rename it, or rebrand it, or something like that.
Right.
So there's both organizations that operate that way, and then there's the effect that culture has upon, I'm thinking of like the MAPS organization, which does not set itself up to fight prohibition, but tries to work within the confines and carve out a little tiny legitimate space that is still very controlled, but
can be taken seriously by the prohibitionists. Instead of trying to be taken seriously by prohibitionists and trying to fit in with prohibition, they ought to be calling the bluff of the prohibitionists and exposing the falsehoods, rather than just kind of going along with them unquestioningly.
Yes, yeah. So I think that's a relevant paradigm to discuss.
Absolutely. So, I mean, we've identified 5 paradigms, and that's given us a nice systematic way of moving forward from here, is that we can identify time and effort to each one of these paradigms and try and kind of build a bigger picture out of it. Mm-hmm. But we should probably bring this one to a close, because it's been over 2 hours now, and that's a lot of information.
Yeah, I think that's right.
So maybe I kind of had the idea that maybe for the next one, we would focus on Martin Ball, mm-hmm. and maybe bring in a few other thinkers and do the New Age. Is that okay with you, or would you rather do it in a different order?
No, that's fine with me. It's appealing because, as you said earlier, Martin Ball, it does seem like he thinks that he has done all the theorizing necessary about the altered state. Whereas it doesn't seem like the other theories are necessarily working with theorizing about the altered state.
Exactly. So that's why, like, as you said, Ball's is the closest to ego death theory. It's the one that looks the most like the ego death theory. And so he actually uses the term ego transcendence, which hardly anybody else is using that term in reference to entheogens.
Yeah, so I know I agree with that. I think that's a great way to proceed, is looking at
the reason I first thought of that is because my original idea was to do this as a purely audio podcast on Podomatic, and I saw Martin Ball's podcast as being our great kind of competitor, or not competitor, but the one that would look like the most what we were doing. So I thought that we should distance ourselves from what he's doing, so that people just didn't think we were another kind of version of Martin Ball's thought in his podcast. We're definitely not trying to be the same as Martin Ball, mm-hmm. and I think that it would be a good idea for the next thing. It would be a good idea to put that distance in and really specify what we're saying differently from Martin Ball. And I think there's some other thinkers that we can incorporate. I think Ken Wilber is a major additional thinker that we could kind of sandwich into that, because his theories are very similar shape to Martin Ball, but he completely lacks the entheogenic aspect. And in fact, most people that are doing what Martin Ball is doing in terms of New Age, kind of hippy-dippy spirituality, almost all of them lack entheogens. And that's the one great thing that Martin Ball has, is that he's actually put entheogens forcefully in the middle of the pop spiritual New Age paradigm. So yeah, it's a good way forward for us.